Girl secretly interrogates her kidnapper on 911 call. The case of Denise Lee. A young mother is snatched from her own home in the middle of the afternoon. When her husband walks through the door hours later, all he finds are their two small sons, alone in a crib, crying. Their mother is gone without a trace. What nobody realizes yet is that she is still alive, trapped in a stranger's car, and about to do something almost unthinkable. She's going to secretly call 911 from her kidnapper's own phone and pretend the entire time that she is simply talking to him. This is the story of Denise Lee and how her courage in the final hours of her life helped convict her killer and reshaped how America handles emergency calls forever. Denise Lee grew up in Englewood, Florida, the daughter of Rick Goff, a sergeant with the local sheriff's office, and his wife Sue. Rick had spent years working undercover and had developed the kind of hardened instincts that come from decades in law enforcement, but nothing prepared him for the bond he felt the moment his daughter was born. Denise grew up watching her father live a life built around service and protecting others, and in many ways she absorbed that same instinct without ever putting on a badge herself. As a teenager, Denise met Nathan Lee, and the two fell for each other quickly. Their relationship was young and unpolished in the best way. Nathan later described how nervous he was trying to figure out the right way to make things official, eventually landing on a modest ring with a small heart-shaped stone, a gesture Denise treasured far more than expensive jewelry. The two built a life together, married, and soon welcomed two sons, Noah and Adam. By January of 2008, they were living an ordinary, happy life in Northport, Florida, a quiet residential community that neither of them had any reason to think would become the backdrop for a national headline. On the afternoon of January 17, 2008, everything changed. Nathan came home from work around 3:30 in the afternoon, expecting a normal end to the day. Instead, he walked into a house that felt wrong the moment he stepped inside. Denise's purse, her keys, and her cell phone were sitting exactly where she normally left them, but she was nowhere in the house. Their two young sons, 6-month-old Adam and 2-year-old Noah, had been left alone together in a single crib, which was completely out of character for Denise. Nathan searched every room, calling her name, before the panic set in. He picked up the phone and dialed 911. When officers arrived, they noticed there were no obvious signs of forced entry or a struggle. In cases like this, investigators are trained to consider the people closest to the victim first, and for a brief and painful moment, suspicion turned toward Nathan. That changed almost as soon as Denise's father, Sergeant Rick Goff, arrived on scene. Rick's reputation within local law enforcement was well established, and the moment colleagues realized whose daughter was missing, the entire posture of the investigation shifted. Rick knew his son-in-law, and he knew in his gut that Nathan had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance. His focus turned immediately outward, toward whoever might have taken her. Rick's instincts led him first to the Lees' only nearby neighbor. She recalled something strange from earlier that afternoon, sometime between 1 and 2 o'clock. A green Camaro had pulled into the driveway of Denise and Nathan's home, driven by a man she had never seen before. She remembered him staring at her long enough that it unsettled her, prompting her to retreat inside her own house. It was a small detail, but for investigators desperate for any lead, it became the first real thread to pull. Rick immediately mobilized his contacts within the sheriff's office. Helicopters, K-9 units, and patrol officers fanned out across the area, searching for any trace of a green Camaro or any sign of Denise. For a father who had spent his career finding people who didn't want to be found, this search was unlike anything he had ever faced, because this time, the missing person was his own child. At 6:13 that evening, nearly 3 hours after Nathan's initial call, a 911 dispatcher in a neighboring county answered a call that immediately felt different. The caller was a woman, clearly frightened, and speaking in a strange, indirect way. The dispatcher quickly realized the caller was not speaking freely. She was disguising her real conversation, making it sound to anyone nearby like she was simply talking to the person she was with, while actually feeding details to the operator on the line. It was Denise. She had managed to get hold of her abductor's phone without him noticing, and dialed for help while pretending the entire time that she was speaking directly to him. Denise had grown up around law enforcement her entire life, and in that moment, she used every bit of it. She worked in small, careful details, hoping the dispatcher and her father's team could piece together where she was and who had taken her. She never let on that she had turned his own phone against him. But before she could reveal enough to pinpoint her location, her abductor noticed his phone was gone from where he'd left it, and the call abruptly cut off. The recording was quickly sent to Rick's team, who asked him to confirm whether the distressed voice on the line belonged to his daughter. It did. Hearing Denise's voice, frightened and clearly in danger, was devastating for a father who had spent years learning to compartmentalize the worst parts of his job. But it also gave the family something they didn't have an hour earlier: confirmation that she was alive and a handful of new details to chase. The phone she'd called from was a prepaid burner, which meant it couldn't be traced to an exact location, but investigators now had fragments of information to work with, and they intended to use every one of them. Just minutes after Denise's call reached dispatch, another 911 call came in from a different area entirely. This caller claimed to know the identity of the man in the green Camaro. Investigators finally had a name: Michael King. It matched the physical description given by Denise and Nathan's neighbor, right down to the green Camaro. Rick's mind briefly went to the possibility that this was somehow connected to his own career in law enforcement, a grudge or revenge plot from his past. But the name Michael King meant nothing to him. This wasn't personal. It was something far more random and far more frightening. Detectives traced Michael King to a house on Sardinia Avenue in Northport, only a short drive from Denise and Nathan's home. A tactical team moved in immediately, but what they found when they entered was not what anyone had hoped for. The house appeared abandoned in a hurry. A television blared in an empty room. Furniture had been stripped out, and trash was scattered through the space. Denise was not there, but there were unmistakable signs that she had been, and recently. In one of the bedrooms, investigators found a hastily assembled bed, a hair elastic tangled in the sheets, and strands of duct tape with long, light brown hair stuck to it, hair that closely resembled Denise's. For Rick, that discovery was one of the most frightening moments of the entire search. In his years of experience, a victim being moved from one location to another is one of the clearest warning signs that time is running out. Every hour that passed made a safe recovery less likely, and Rick understood that better than almost anyone else involved in the search. Around the same time, a driver on a nearby highway called 911 to report something disturbing. She had pulled up alongside a green Camaro and could see what looked like a hand banging against the inside of the back window, along with muffled screaming. She followed for a short distance, uncertain what to do, describing what she was seeing to the dispatcher in real time. But the driver of the Camaro appeared to notice he was being followed and suddenly ran a red light, cutting across traffic to lose her. The witness's information was passed along by the dispatcher who took the call, but due to a breakdown in communication between the neighboring counties' dispatch systems, the report never reached the officers actively searching for Denise. It was a small human error, buried under the chaos of a fast-moving case, but it would end up being one of the most consequential mistakes of the entire investigation. Denise disappeared into the night once again, and the search teams had no idea how close they had just come. Hours passed with no new leads. It was now well past 9 at night, more than 6 hours since Denise had first vanished from her home. Rick, his wife, Nathan, and the rest of the family had a name, a car, a general area, and still no sign of Denise herself. Then, over the police radio, Rick heard the update he'd been waiting all night for. A green Camaro matching the description had been spotted, and officers were now in active pursuit. Rick stayed locked onto the radio as the pursuit unfolded and officers closed in on the vehicle. But when the car was finally stopped and searched, the news that came back stopped him cold. The driver, Michael King, was alone. Denise was not in the car. For a moment, no one knew what that meant. Had she escaped somewhere along the route? Had something worse happened? The only person who could answer that question was now sitting in the back of a patrol car, refusing to say much of anything. King was brought in for questioning, and investigators expected that with enough pressure, he would eventually reveal where Denise was, especially if there was still a chance to bring her home alive. Instead, King offered a version of events that stunned everyone in the room. He claimed that he was the victim, insisting that he himself had been kidnapped that day by unknown assailants. Detectives didn't believe a word of it, but King refused to budge from his story, and without a confession or a location, the clock kept ticking. While King sat in an interrogation room repeating his claim, other detectives searched his Camaro and found a heart-shaped ring in the back seat. It was brought to Nathan and Rick, and both of them confirmed instantly that it belonged to Denise, the same ring Nathan had given her not long after they started dating years earlier. It was a small, deliberate piece of evidence, one that would matter far more than anyone realized in that moment. With Denise's ring confirmed, investigators tried once more to get King talking, this time attempting to play into his story in hopes he might slip and reveal something useful. But King requested an attorney, and the interrogation came to an abrupt stop. Investigators were no closer to knowing where Denise actually was, and the family clung to whatever hope remained that she might still be found alive somewhere, injured but breathing. 2 days later, on January 19th, a tip led search teams to a wooded area near Plantation Boulevard, not far from King's home. Cadaver dogs quickly zeroed in on a patch of disturbed earth. Investigators began to excavate the site, and what they uncovered ended any remaining hope the family had been holding on to. Denise's body was recovered from a shallow grave. She had been sexually assaulted and shot to death. For Rick, the news arrived over the same radio he had used to coordinate the search for 2 agonizing days, and it brought him to his knees. The family had to sit their young sons down and explain, in the gentlest way possible, that their mother was not coming home. The case moved toward trial in the following months. Michael King, a 36-year-old unemployed plumber who had been facing foreclosure on his home at the time of the kidnapping, was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. He pleaded not guilty to every charge, forcing Denise's family to relive every detail of her final hours in a courtroom, in front of a jury who had never met her and knew nothing about the woman she had been. The trial, held in Sarasota County in August of 2009, brought together an enormous amount of evidence, much of it left behind, whether knowingly or not, by Denise herself in her final hours. Investigators presented DNA evidence, hair samples, the duct tape recovered from King's bedroom, the shovel he had borrowed from a relative, and a shell casing later matched to a handgun King had fired at a shooting range earlier that same day. The defense pushed back hard, pointing out that the actual murder weapon was never recovered and challenging the reliability of certain witnesses. One eyewitness, who had followed the Camaro on the highway and reported the banging and screaming she'd seen, was unable to positively identify King as the driver during cross-examination, which the defense used to cast doubt on her account. But the most powerful evidence in the entire trial came from a source no one could argue with, Denise's own 911 call. When the recording was played for the jury, her voice filled the courtroom, frightened, breathless, and unmistakably real. She could be heard identifying herself by name, describing her husband and her children, and pleading to be let go, all while secretly feeding details to the dispatcher that would later help identify her kidnapper. It was heartbreaking for her family to hear again, but it was also undeniable proof for the jury of exactly what Denise had endured, and how deliberately she had tried to help investigators, even while fearing for her life. Piece by piece, prosecutors laid out just how much Denise had managed to leave behind despite her circumstances. She had slipped her ring off and left it in the back seat, knowing it could be traced back to her. She had pulled strands of her own hair out by the root, understanding that root-attached hair could be used for DNA identification, and left it stuck to the duct tape in King's bedroom. Investigators and family members alike would later describe her actions in that final day as remarkably composed and strategic. The instincts of someone who had grown up around police work and understood, even in the most terrifying moment of her life, exactly what evidence could matter later. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all charges. A short time later, the jury recommended a sentence of death, and the judge imposed it. For Denise's family, it was a moment of complicated relief. Justice finally delivered, but arriving far too late to bring her back. In the years that followed, Denise's story reshaped emergency response procedures across the state of Florida. One of the most devastating revelations from the case was that a separate 911 call from the witness, who had seen the struggle inside King's Camaro on the highway, had been mishandled due to a breakdown in communication between two different county dispatch systems. That report never reached the officers actively searching for Denise, and to this day, her family has said they believe that miscommunication cost precious time they could never get back. Rick and the rest of the family pushed hard for accountability and for systemic change, and their efforts led directly to the passage of the Denise Lee Act, a piece of Florida legislation establishing new, standardized training requirements for 911 operators statewide. Nathan channeled his grief into building the Denise Lee Foundation, an organization dedicated to improving 911 systems nationwide. He has spent years traveling the country, speaking directly with emergency dispatchers and telling them Denise's story, hoping that no other family has to experience what his did. Denise's sister, Amanda, chose to become a 911 dispatcher herself, dedicating her career to honoring her sister's memory in the most direct way she could. Noah and Adam, the two boys who were found alone in their crib that January afternoon, grew up carrying their mother's story with them, and both have spoken about how deeply her sacrifice shaped who they became. Decades after the crime, Michael King remained on death row while his case moved through the appeals process. In 2026, Florida's governor signed his death warrant, and King was ultimately executed by lethal injection that March, closing a chapter that Denise's family had waited nearly 2 decades to see reach its conclusion. Members of her family were present that day, saying they felt it was something they owed to Denise, to be there and see it through to the end. What makes Denise Lee's story endure isn't only the tragedy of what happened to her, though that tragedy is real and devastating. It's the extraordinary presence of mind she showed in her final hours, using every resource available to her, a stolen phone call, a discarded ring, a few strands of her own hair, to fight for her family, even as she feared she might not survive the day. Her instincts helped convict the man responsible, and her family's response to unimaginable loss helped change how an entire state trains the people who answer calls for help. In the truest sense, Denise never stopped trying to protect the people she loved, right up until her very last moments, and in many ways she still is.